Will come to order. I know that a quorum is present. Without objections, the chair is recognized to call a recess at any time. Welcome to today's hearing titled GAO's Uncovers Biden-Harris FAFSA Failures. Thank you for being here today. Frankly, I wish this hearing had not been necessary. Once again, the committee is addressing ongoing failures of the Biden-Harris administration's attempt to implement the free application for federal students' aid, or FAFSA. The road to today's hearing has been a long and bumpy one. For years, completing the FAFSA form has been a challenge. The form was deemed too complex and confusing, so Congress passed the FAFSA Simplification Act in 2020. The Biden-Harris administration had plenty of time to accomplish this with a very clear goal: to make the FAFSA process easier and more efficient. The idea was simple: reduce the number of questions, streamline the process, and make it easier for families to determine the financial aid eligibility. The law was set to take full effect in 2023, but here we are in late 2024, and the situation is far from resolved. Implemented over 30 years ago and once considered the doorway to education opportunity, the FAFSA has become a headache and nightmare for millions of students and their parents, thanks to this administration. Since day one, the Biden-Harris administration had time and resources to get this right. Yet the Department of Education failed to deliver and instead knowingly released a failed FAFSA. It reallocated valuable time and resources to push a radical political agenda, the unconstitutional student loan forgiveness scheme. Instead of focusing on implementing the simplified FAFSA, they justified cutting FAFSA support staff and leaving 3/4 of calls unanswered for months. For panicked parents and students who waited for hours for someone not to pick up their phone call, now you know why. The FAFSA rollout was mired in delays, errors, frustration, and for some of our most vulnerable students, the loss of their dreams for higher education. The impact of the Biden administration's failure on real lives has been devastating. Over 430,000 fewer students submitted a FAFSA last year, leaving them and countless others unsure if they could afford post-secondary education. Unfortunately, it has been the low-income students who were hit the hardest. Some college campuses or some community colleges are now dealing with significant declines in enrollment, and institutions across the country are struggling to finalize financial aid packages due to the department's incompetence. This committee, bipartisan lawmakers, and the public have all demanded answers. And yet the department has been largely unresponsive to requests for information, even going so far as to stonewall a nonpartisan GAO, the Government Accountability Office's investigation into FAFSA failures. It's taken a subpoena from this body for the department to finally respond to GAO's request. This lack of accountability is unacceptable, as students and taxpayers pay the price. This committee refused to sit idle while the department mismanages the futures of millions of prospective students. Thanks to Republicans who have made this a priority, the GAO has released preliminary findings from its investigation. We will discuss those findings at length today. Some of them are horrific and inexplicable. The Biden-Harris administration has left millions of students and families scrambling in the dark. Its response to its failures has been to demand an additional $400 million to do what they've already been given time and financial resources to do. By the way, that's $900 per every student who could not complete the FAFSA, the broken FAFSA. This administration has a lot of explaining to do to regain the trust of American families before the next FAFSA hopefully is released with a full and accurate functionality in December. This committee has continued to work to deliver transparency and accountability to American families throughout this process. At the end of the day, it's really not about the form. It's about keeping a promise that if you work hard and honest and get an education, you can obtain your dreams and hopes and dreams. No administration has a right to stand in the way for that promise. With that, I yield to the ranking member for her opening statement. Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Owens, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us here today. We know that a college degree is the surest pathway to success in America. And for years, the Pell Grant has helped millions of students go to college who otherwise may not have been able to go. That is why 4 years ago, we came together and passed the FAFSA Simplification Act, which aimed to streamline the free application for federal student aid form and expand student aid eligibility. Regrettably, implementation of the law has been derailed by a series of mistakes made by the Department of Education, leading to delays and ongoing setbacks in the rollout of the new application. It's frustrating because aside from the dozens of letters Congress has sent, this is not the first hearing we've had this year about this same issue, nor is this the first application cycle with these issues. I'm a school teacher and principal by trade, and I served on the Miami-Dade County School Board. I continue to dedicate myself to education by sending thousands of Black boys to college, building a new generation of husbands and fathers. So I know how stressful the college application process is. Parents are frustrated at the FAFSA process, and college presidents alike are complaining to me. I want to be somebody's students, along with their families, have spent hours trying to reach someone at the Federal Student Aid Office, only to have their calls go unanswered. Or for those who have finally gotten through to an agent, many have received incorrect information. I empathize with the frustration of college advisors who want to help students enroll in this school year, but they too have been left in the dark about what aid students are entitled to. And most of all, I'm most upset that the delays and ongoing setbacks with FAFSA have meant that some of our want-to-be-somebody students have just decided not to go to college at all. They have just given up. Today's hearing isn't just about who knew what and what did they know, although we do need to get to the bottom of all of that. This hearing, at its core, is about the students who have been denied an opportunity because of the department's mistakes. And how can we make sure that the department does not repeat those mistakes for the upcoming school year? Time is of the essence, and students need answers now. I'm encouraged by some of the progress the department has made to improve the FAFSA process, but much more is needed to get this process back on track. With that, I yield forward. With that, I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. 14 days after this hearing, which is October 8th, 2024. And without objections, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other material referenced during this hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I now turn to introduction of our two distinguished witnesses. The first is Ms. Melissa Imre Aries, who is the Director of Education, Workforce, and Income Security Issues with GAO in Washington, D.C. Thank you. The second witness is Marisol Cruz Kane, who is Director of GAO's Information Technology and Cybersecurity Team in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much. We thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to Community Rules 1, I would ask that you each limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. I would also like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibilities to provide accurate information to the subcommittees. I will first recognize Ms. Emery Aries.
Thank you. Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Wilson, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss GAO's work on the impact of the new FAFSA rollout. Our findings focus on how the rollout affected students and examine how education communicated with both students and colleges during the rollout. We are making a total of 7 recommendations in this study to help ensure that education is prepared for the start of the next FAFSA cycle. I will highlight several of these in my oral statement, and all 7 of them are included in my written statement. In terms of our findings, we found that FAFSA delays and technical issues contributed to fewer students applying for aid. About 432,000 fewer students have submitted a FAFSA this cycle compared to last year, representing an overall decrease of 3%. Most of this decrease came from high school seniors and other first-time applicants who had a 9% decline in submissions. Declines in submissions were particularly pronounced among lower-income students and families. For example, among independent applicants, the percent decline in submissions was largest for those with incomes of $30,000 or less. For dependent applicants, the drop in submissions was largest for families with incomes between $30,000 and $48,000. Students who did not complete a FAFSA this cycle could continue to miss out on financial aid they need to pursue college. Given this, we are recommending that education develop an outreach strategy to connect with students who did not submit a FAFSA and encourage them to apply during the upcoming cycle. Turning now to our findings on education's communications with students, we found that education did not consistently provide students with timely information or support. For example, nearly 3/4 of calls to education's call center went unanswered during the first 5 months of the rollout due to understaffing. Education had underestimated call center demand. As a result, there were fewer staff to answer calls during the first 5 months of the rollout compared to the last year, despite there being twice the call volume. We are recommending that education plan for and ensure hiring of sufficient staff to meet call demand going forwards. Education also used the call center as its method of providing FAFSA translation services for other languages, since the FAFSA is only currently available in English and Spanish. However, education provided confusing guidance on how families could obtain translation services. Education's website tells users to contact the call center and press the number 7 for translation services, but the number 7 is not a phone tree option. The only 2 language options that callers can easily access through the phone tree are either English or Spanish. Therefore, callers would likely struggle to figure out how to request translation services for other languages. We are recommending that education improve translation services by providing a clear path through the call center menu. Education also did not provide timely information to students about processing delays. For example, education did not provide any confirmation that it had received applications from about 34,000 students who applied solely using paper forms, nor did it notify these students directly that it was delaying processing of their forms until at least August. Accordingly, we are recommending that education develop a comprehensive plan for providing applicants with timely updates. I will now turn to our findings on education's communications with colleges. We found that education consistently failed to meet promised deadlines. For example, the department was late in sending FAFSA student records to colleges, which are typically sent within days of the rollout. Education initially told colleges they would send records at the end of January, but the day before colleges were expecting them, the department announced a further delay to mid-March. We are recommending that education develop policies to communicate key milestones of future FAFSA cycles to colleges in a timely and reliable manner. In conclusion, students and their families deserve a FAFSA process that works. Education has an opportunity to learn from its recent struggles and make the financial aid process easier for everyone. However, education needs to move quickly to address these issues and rebuild trust in the FAFSA process. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to next recognize Mrs. Cruz Kane.
Chairman Owens, Ranking Member Wilson, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting GAO to contribute to this important discussion about the modernization of the new FAFSA system. As you know, in late December 2023, FAFSA deployed a new system to process the 2024-2025 forms. Subsequently, applicants reported availability issues, submission errors, and significant load times. According to FSA, processing and data errors affected approximately 30% of FAFSA forms. These issues left students in colleges without the information they needed to make important financial decisions about the upcoming school year. Today, I will focus on issues affecting the development and oversight of the new FAFSA system. In particular, I will discuss preliminary results of our ongoing work on system delays and defects and our completed audit results on system oversight. Education has been working to replace FSA's legacy system with the new FAFSA processing system since early 2021. In March 2022, the agency awarded the development contract for the new system. This contract required 3 major capabilities and 25 associated contractual requirements, each to be deployed by October 1st, 2023. The 3 major capabilities were, first, the ability of student and parents to complete the FAFSA application and submit corrections and updated information. Second, the use of that data to determine a student's initial and ongoing eligibility for federal aid. And last, the ability to generate and distribute eligibility results for applicants, school partners, and other authorized recipients. However, in early 2023, FSA moved the delivery of these 3 capabilities to December 2023. FSA officials told us this decision was because of the complexity of implementing new legal requirements while modernizing a process that had not been altered in 40 years. Ultimately, FSA decided to deploy only 7 of the 25 contractual requirements in its initial release, with the remaining 18 delayed to a later date. In March 2024, FSA deployed 9 of the remaining requirements, with additional functionality being deployed between March and August of this year. Agency officials told us that the remaining requirements will be deployed across several releases starting in fall 2024 and ending in calendar year 26. However, FSA has not yet told us which requirements will be addressed in each subsequent release. Contributing to these delays, we found that FSA did not always effectively manage the system development. First, FSA did not fully test the system, leading to numerous performance problems. After the initial deployment, FSA identified 55 defects, which was almost twice as many as were identified when testing the system as a whole prior to launch. As of March 2024, 35 of those defects have been resolved, but 20 remain unresolved, the majority of which were categorized as critical or high severity. For example, one unresolved issue resulted in FSA initially overestimating some students' eligibility by incorrectly excluding their family's assets from the calculations. Secondly, FSA did not always follow its own guidance for defining and managing contractual requirements or testing the system. This made it harder to ensure that all the requirements were being fully addressed by the resulting system functionality. In addition, FSA did not conduct an independent review of the project's processes, products, and risks throughout its life cycle. This limited the agency's ability to identify and address cost, schedule, and performance risks. Finally, key to these shortcomings is education's lack of consistent and effective leadership. The chief information officers from both education and FSA were not involved in key governance and oversight activities for the system. Such involvement is essential for successful IT modernizations such as this one. In summary, because FSA did not effectively manage the project, the system was plagued with delays and defects. It's critical for education to expeditiously implement the 6 recommendations highlighted in my written statement. This will ensure that the system's issues do not repeat themselves in future releases. This concludes my remarks, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Under Committee Rule 9, we'll now question witnesses under 5-minute rule, and I'll begin the process. Ms. Emery Eris, the FAFSA is usually released with a full functionality by October 1st. For the 2024-2025 FAFSA cycle, the Department of Education missed the October 1st, 2023 deadline completely. And then when the FAFSA was finally released at the end of December, several elements were delayed. Can you talk about what elements were delayed and how long they will be delayed?
Sure. To begin with, as you mentioned, there was the 90-day delay in the availability of the form. Subsequent to that, there was a delay in the department's processing of the form that was 161 days late. After that, the department provided students the functionality to make corrections late as well. That was 197 days late. Education then finally began processing paper FAFSAs in August, which was 305 days late. And we know that the function of doing batch corrections for colleges has yet to be instituted, and we expect it to be at least a year late, maybe more at this point.
Okay. As you guys do your investigation, can you identify who it is that is failing the system? Are there individuals that you can identify, or is it just the system that is failing us overall? How does that work? I mean, normally, if somebody is this incompetent, they're fired. Is there any way that we can figure out where this is happening within the system?
Although I wouldn't be able to speak to that particular issue, I know that there have been leadership changes at the department, and I would say that we've had senior leaders very involved in this study. We've had GAO's Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel meeting regularly with the Chief of Staff and General Counsel at the Department of Education.
Okay. I've been amazed by the number of press releases produced by the Biden-Harris administration by this illegal student debt scheme. It seems like every other month we had something with that. Was the department clear and timely when it came down to communicating with students and colleges regarding the FAFSA delays and problems?
It was not.
Okay. Ms. Cruz-Kane, when did the federal student aid first realize it was likely to miss the October 2023 release deadline?
They first realized it in August of 2022.
So it was a year prior, almost, yeah. How long did it take for the federal student aid to finally tell the public? They knew about a year early. When did they finally tell the public?
They made their final decision in early 2023, and that decision was made after briefing leadership from education and also the Executive Office of the President. And the public was notified about the shift from October to December on March 21st of 2023, so that was about 7 months later after they began the discussions. And then finally, in November 15th, 2023, the public was notified that the application would be available on December 31st, and that was about 8 months after the initial notification of the delay.
Okay. Has the federal student aid finalized a detailed plan for the upcoming year's FAFSA to avoid a repeat of last year's disaster?
They've verbally given us promises that they're going to continue to do better testing and have better plans to address system defects, but we have not seen any documents that involve what the test plans would look like, if they plan on conducting any independent reviews. So we've heard a lot of testimonial evidence about their plans, but haven't received any documentation to back those up.
Okay. So the simplification law has been in effect beginning of this administration. 4 years later, we still do not have sure if the FAFSA will be fully functional for a second year in a row, which is totally unacceptable. It is amazing that this has been going on. This has been around for 30 years, and it only took 3.5 to just blow it up totally, and here we are still trying to figure it out. So thank you so much. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member for purpose of asking the question.
Thank you. Ms. Emery Iris, in March, there were 40% fewer students submitting the FAFSA compared to last year. As of September, the FAFSA completion gap has decreased to just 2%. The student support strategy established by the department and key partners enable hundreds of on-the-ground organizations across the country to reach 750,000 additional students during the summer and submit roughly 4 million FAFSA applications. To what extent did GAO look into the impact of this strategy, and why was it so effective in closing the completion gap? And how can the department build off of this strategy to engage with students who did not complete the FAFSA this year and encourage them to submit for the upcoming year?
In our work, we did find that education partnered with many individuals, states, school districts, nonprofits, did extensive email and text message campaigns, as well as social media outreach to try to reach those students. And they did, in fact, close the gap significantly. In our report, we mentioned that there were 1.4 fewer applicants in mid-May, and by late August, that had dropped to 430,000. So the department has significantly closed the gap due to those partnerships with those groups, and we think that the department needs to continue community partnerships, needs to continue to engage with the students that have not submitted FAFSA so that they are not left behind and lost.
Okay. In May, Secretary Cardona announced robust plans to modernize the Office of Federal Student Aid and its processes and structures moving forward. For example, FSA plans to review its contracts and acquisition procedures to hold vendors accountable for meeting key deadlines, achieving desired outcomes, and providing the best value to the agency and protecting taxpayers' resources. The plan would also develop a new IT innovation team that would bring in critical IT expertise to strengthen FSA's IT capabilities. Did GAO look into any of these efforts for its study? If not, can you provide more context into the decision not to do so? This is for Ms. Cruz-Kane.
Sure. We have not looked at the items that you mentioned. We do have a larger ongoing study, and that is something that we plan on looking at. What surprised me was the contract that they're currently using is firm fixed price. So there's really no incentive structure in the contract to hold that contractor accountable for being on time, delivering functionality. So that was a bit of a surprise for us, but part of our ongoing work will look at the changes that they're going to make, whether it's in the contract structure or their policies and procedures, to make sure that they're overseeing the contract better moving forward.
Okay. In your testimony, you made clear that the findings and recommendations are still preliminary. Can you please share what additional items GSO still intends to study within this engagement?
Yes, so we plan to deliver or study when FSA plans to deliver the remaining functionality and what the status of those plans are. We want to look further into the level that the system was tested prior to launch, what testing has been done since the launch, and what testing will be done as additional functionality is rolled out, including for the next FAFSA cycle. We're going to look a little bit more into the extent to which FSA and the Department of Education were overseeing the contractor during the development of the system, and then whether FSA had the appropriate skill sets to effectively manage the contractor and perform oversight.
Do you have any, can you anticipate, when do you anticipate finalizing the findings and the recommendations?
Right now, we're just saying 2025.
Okay, thank you, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Grothman from
In a press release yesterday, the department said that the 24-25 FAFSA form was available on December 30th, 2023 for all students to complete for short periods of time. Can you describe that, what that vague phrase, short periods of time, actually looked like for students?
It meant less than an hour on the 30th and 31st of December.
You good for an hour? Okay.
Right. Less than an hour each day.
Would you agree with the statement that all students were able to complete the form when it was launched in December, on December 30th?
No.
No?
No, the department itself said that it was not consistently available until January 7th, and we know further that there were many technical problems with the form when it was made available, and there were some students that were not able to submit forms until many months later.
Okay. In your press release, was it yesterday, the department said that some, quote, some students encountered technical difficulties that made completing the form difficult or impossible after the 24-25 FAFSA form opened fully in January 7th. The word "some" in that statement suggests problems were not widespread. What percentage of students do you think faced technical difficulties after January 7th?
Although we don't have an exact number from the department, we know that many, many students were affected. The Department of Education acknowledges that there were over 40 technical issues with the initial rollout, and there were large groups of students that were not able to complete applications. For example, we know of one particular technical issue that affected hundreds of thousands of students.
Okay, could you give us a wild guess? 5%, 55%, 80%?
We could do that for the record.
You could do it in the future.
We could look into it for the record in terms of an estimate.
Yeah, I'd like to know. Can you provide examples of technical problems that made it hard for students and their family to complete the new FAFSA? And do you think these are fixed by this year?
Right. There are a wide variety of problems. For example, if you were born in the year 2000, you simply couldn't proceed. You could not complete the FAFSA if you happened to be born in the year 2000. That was fixed, but that was not fixed until March. There are other issues in terms of signatures disappearing. If you go back to a saved application, the student's or the parent's signature could disappear, rendering it then incomplete, and that has still not been resolved. There are other issues with parents not being able to contribute information, parents not being able to move past certain screens. There are also issues with incorrect information being provided. Graduate students are falsely told that they are eligible for Pell Grants. This is not true, and this is not resolved.
Okay. What technical support options did you offer students when they encountered a problem?
Education's main support was its call center. However, most people could not reach call center representatives. About 3/4 of calls went unanswered.
Okay. In your press release yesterday, the department said their call center received a, quote, unprecedented number of calls after the FAFSA was launched on December 30th. Given that the department knew families would be filling out the updated FAFSA for the first time, did you prepare your call center to answer these questions, or did they maintain at least the same number of staff as the last year? Did you bring in extra staff for the end of the year?
The Department of Education vastly underestimated the need for call center staff. And as a result, they vastly understaffed the call centers.
Okay. As students continue to encounter significant technical issues, were the department's proposed workarounds for the litany of bugs effective, would you say?
Although we didn't assess the effectiveness of the workarounds, I can tell you that students weren't always told about the workarounds. Oftentimes, students were told, exit, try again later, but they were never then told when a workaround was developed. And it might have taken several months for a workaround to be developed, and in the meantime, students could have been going into the application and just trying and coming across the same barriers. It was not helpful for students.
Okay. Are there any of your proposed workarounds you'd like to highlight for the benefit of the committee?
There was one workaround in particular that instructed students with a parent who lived abroad to falsely put in a U.S. address in order to contribute information to the FAFSA.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you to the witnesses. Sorry for the acoustics in here. It's kind of hard to hear. We're on this committee, we were all excited to pass FAFSA simplification. It's something we talked about for many years, so needless to say, we are all aware of the troubled implementation of that act. I don't think there's any question that the rollout has been problematic. We know that. Thank you for your work and your recommendations. I hope that this hearing will focus on understanding why it happened and preventing it in the future, and not become more of a political administration bashing. That's not our purpose here today. We must and we should focus on improving the student aid process. Last week, I led a letter to House leadership supporting the White House's $2.4 billion budget anomaly request for the student aid administration. This funding will be vital for sustaining a timely FAFSA rollout in the future and providing the necessary support for students, families, and institutions. One of the recommendations GAO provided to support students during the FAFSA process is to increase capacity at the FAFSA call center. And you were just talking about the number of calls that went unanswered. And I can understand how frustrating that is for families in the process. It's my understanding that since January, the department has added more than 700 new agents. That's an 80% increase to handle the increased call volumes as it prepares for the 2025-26 FAFSA season. So, Ms. Emery Arist, I didn't see this information included in your testimony. Is there a reason why this information was not included in the GAO's findings?
We looked at call center capacity during the first 5 months, which is when people would typically call with questions. I would say that we are encouraged that the call center staffing has gone up since that time. I would note, however, that that addition pretty much brings up the call center staffing to the level that it was for the prior cycle. And again, the call demand this past year was more than double for that prior cycle. So while it's encouraging, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that there will be enough people to answer the phones this coming year.
Understood, and you said it's encouraging, but has the increased call center capacity improved customer service for students and their families navigating this process?
It's encouraging to know that they have hired additional folks. Our concern, though, is that during the first 5 months of the rollout, when most people were struggling to figure out what was going on with the FAFSA, that they couldn't get someone to answer the phone.
Understood, and we appreciate that. So in May, Secretary Cardona announced some robust plans to modernize the Office of Federal Student Aid and its processes and structures. For example, FSA plans to develop a new IT innovation team to bring in critical expertise. So, Mrs. Cruz-Kane, did GAO look into any of the modernization efforts for its study?
We do have plans to look into those new processes and procedures in our ongoing work. We have much more to do. Our preliminary findings were just those that we were able to look at in the short time that we've been doing the work.
And were any suggestions for FSA leadership as they embark on this modernization included in your recommendations?
Yes, so we do have a recommendation for the Department of Education's CIO to have a more defined role in the rollout, and also FSA's CIO to have more insight into the requirements, the testing, and the independent verification.
Did you look at, it's my understanding there were 6 CIOs in the Department of Education recently. Did you look into any implications of that, what seems to be a pretty high turnover rate in that position in your report?
We did not look into specific impacts, but recent GAO work that we've done, IT executives say that a CIO needs to be in place for 3 to 5 years to be effective,
Right.
but also 5 to 7 years to implement a large-scale change such as this one.
And I'll ask both of you kind of a big picture question. Obviously, there were technological complications. Was it the technological complications that added to this, or was it the turnover of staff, or just the size of the project? In the big picture, what all added up to make this, what we all agree was a pretty colossal fail out of the rollout happen? And with the focus on how we can improve it going forward.
I think one of the big things was FAFSA underestimated the need for skilled workers. So they told us that the skilled workers that were needed to do the development were also deployed to different high-scale projects. So I really think they need to start hiring and estimating the amount of resources it's going to take to implement some of these new requirements that they're going to release in the subsequent cycles, and also just stick to the best practices for systems acquisition and make sure that their CIOs are more involved in the rollout.
Thank you. And I'm almost out of time, or I am out of time, but maybe if you could submit your response to the record so I can yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like now to recognize Mr. Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for both of our witnesses for being here. Ms. Cruz-Kane, one of the most concerning facts about the FAFSA simplification rollout, the debacle that was that, is that, or that continues to be that, is that the Biden-Harris administration knew that the release would be delayed and broken, and your investigation found that over a year in advance, in August of 22, the Department of Education began preparing for this delayed release of the form and adjusting deadlines from October 23 to December 23, but the public wasn't notified until March 23. My understanding is that the department's contract to create the form named 25 key system requirements that would define what a fully functioning FAFSA would entail. Can you briefly discuss some of those requirements?
Sure. So the 25 requirements were broken out. 8 of them related to the input and the development of the form, 10 of them eligibility determination calculations, and 7 of them were related to results distribution and availability. And 7 of those 25 were released in the initial release. And then in March 2024, 9 more were deployed. And in December, the ones that were deployed were mainly focused on input. And then in March, with the 9 more that were deployed, they were focused on the eligibility calculations. And then we are unsure of when the rest of them are going to be released. FSA told us that they were going to release them in the subsequent cycles, beginning this next cycle and ending in the 2027-2028 FAFSA cycle.
So they initially failed to fulfill the 18 contractual obligations, 7 out of 25, but they released the form anyway, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. And they waited a year after that to conduct a requirements oversight review to ensure that it was ready, didn't they?
Yes.
Yeah, it's obviously very concerning. In your testimony, you also mentioned the importance of having effective IT leadership, particularly from the CIO. Have the CIOs conducted frequent progress reviews of FAFSA?
So we do know that the education CIO, normally a project of this scale would be talked at high-level annual and quarter reviews, but this particular project was never discussed at any of them. Also, education applies risk ratings to IT systems, and this one received a risk rating of 3 in September 2021, and then the risk rating was never updated again until 5 months after the deployment. So that's pretty concerning that they weren't monitoring the contract, monitoring the status of the system, and updating the risk rating, because 3 is sort of moderate. At this point, 5 would be more appropriate.
So it's a 1 to 5 scale, and they
Yes,
got
sir.
a 3. Yeah. Last week, well, as you know, the Education Department's had 6 CIOs since the enactment of the FAFSA simplification. Again, I put that in quotes, just 3 years ago. And last week, they announced that there's hiring yet another CIO. I'm guessing that you might agree that another change in leadership is needed or warranted. But again, with this turnover, it, I think, illustrates the chaos that's marked this process. How would you say this constant turnover in CIO, 6 in about 3 years, has impacted the FAFSA development?
We didn't look at the turnover more as just the role that that person would play in the process. So education CIO did not have a defined role in the FPS rollout. They delegated their authority to the FSA CIO, which we also found that they did not have a big role or a defined role in what they were supposed to do during significant milestones during the rollout. So at the education level, they were delegating to FSA, so the turnover there, it was 6 people, but if they weren't discussing it with the CIO, then the effect, we are unsure what that would be.
You know, I've heard from several universities in my district about not just the FAFSA challenges, but the continued additional requirements from the department. You know, it's the financial aid administrators who bear the burden of the mistakes made by the education department. When the department wasn't answering their phones, the financial aid administrators at the colleges across the country are the ones having to talk to the parents and the students, but they're in the dark in terms of the answers that they can provide from the department because of their failures. And so we need to keep remembering that it's the students, it's the parents, and it's the institutions that suffer, and the American people suffer as a result. Thank you again to both of our witnesses, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for joining us today and for testifying before the committee and sharing your thoughts. As mentioned in the testimony, students who have parents or spouses with Social Security numbers face significant unique challenges when attempting to complete the FAFSA application. It is a cumbersome application. It always has been. I am a former professor. And of course, I was a student before I was a professor, and I have grandchildren, and of course, I understand this form a little bit. But the department released an update yesterday that the FAFSA applications submitted by students with undocumented parents are up by about 5% since last year. And that is a good step in the right direction. Let me just say that. Ms. Emery Aris, is that right? One of the recommendations is to overhaul the submission process for this population of students to address the current barriers. And I think you've suggested some things that you would have FAFSA leadership do as they embark upon this modernization. If you could just mention those again.
Happy to. There are two key components that are still not fixed for this population. One is the ability to do ID verification. That has been something that has been plagued with multiple problems and has been temporarily suspended, but the department needs to eventually do it to comply with statutory requirements. The other issue is that, unlike their peers, students from mixed status families where a parent doesn't have a Social Security number, those parents cannot automatically bring in their tax information from the IRS, which means that they have to manually input their tax information, which is a burden on those families.
Okay, so, you know, you mentioned that there were certain things that you all didn't include. I'm a little disappointed about that, but let me move on. As we continue to work to address these issues, and we clearly need to do that, it certainly was not a great rollout. I am particularly interested in better understanding how the department is working to remedy the challenges detailed in the GAO's findings. So I was pleased to see that in August, the department announced a robust framework for improving the 2025-26 FAFSA form. You know, we do have to look ahead and try to avoid some of the problems. But specifically, the department established a series of beta tests to find and address issues with the form before it becomes available to all students, and that they, of course, will ensure that, as you said, mixed status families are able to navigate these systems successfully. So despite the work, and Ms. Cruz-Kane, despite this framework serving as a key part of the department's commitment to addressing the errors of the previous cycle, it is not recommended in either testimony. So can you provide more context into GAO's decision not to discuss or include this in this framework?
So my written statement mentions that they are going to plan to do testing with actual users, which is what you're talking about, the beta testing. We did get updated by the department a little bit later than it was allowed to be included in our written statement that they would be performing the beta testing. However, we don't have any details on what that entails. We know what was in the press, that October 1st will be the beginning of the beta testing, and it'll be available for hundreds of students at the beginning, and they hope to scale that up to 1,000 students. But we have not seen the test plans. We're not sure what functionalities are going to be tested. So that is part of our ongoing work, to take a look at those test plans, hopefully to see if they're thorough and to see if they were able to use those plans to better the functionality.
So that is the information that GAO collected in terms of how the department is adjusting?
They did tell us that they planned on doing the beta testing, but we didn't have any more details other than just a simple statement that they were planning to do testing with actual users.
Okay, let me move quickly and say that this question is for both of you if we get time to answer it. But in 2024-25, there's been an issue with promptly identifying errors after system deployment, and issue with escalating the problem through a clear reporting mechanism and chain of command. So based on the investigation, why do you believe that this disconnect is happening? What are GAO's recommendations to ensure that when errors happen in this next cycle that they're dealt with in a timely manner. That's just to each of you. We only have 6 seconds. You may have to send it to me.
I think we can get it in the record, but our recommendation is to do more thorough testing, make sure all the functionality is tested thoroughly to make sure it's functioning as it's intended, and to actually implement that end-user testing.
Thank you very much. You can submit that to me in writing if you like. I would appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm out of time.
Thank you. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Thompson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Critically important. There's no doubt and clear bipartisan agreement that the 24-25 FAFSA rollout was an unmitigated disaster. At a time when there is significant skills gap and workforce shortages across the country, families across my congressional district were left high and dry as they attempted to budget and plan for post-secondary education. Despite years of preparation and millions of taxpayer dollars spent in getting the new FAFSA up and running, the Department of Education under this administration once again failed to deliver for American students. As we approach the release of the 2025-26 FAFSA form, nothing I've seen or heard from federal student aid inspires confidence that the system is fixed. So my first question is for Ms. Emery-Harris. In your testimony, you noted how the department did not notify FAFSA applicants when changes occurred to their aid eligibility after they submitted their form. Can you discuss the impact of this lack of transparency and communication that the department had on students?
Happy to. It's important for students to know how much federal aid they can expect to go to college. College is expensive. And because of that, Pell Grants and federal student loans are often the key to enabling students to go to college. If students get an inaccurate estimate, then they are left high and dry. They don't know how much they can expect to get from the federal government for support, and it makes it very difficult to know which college they can afford. And unfortunately, in this situation, financial aid offers from colleges ended up being delayed because of the department's delays in processing. As I had mentioned earlier, the department was very late in processing financial aid forms, and as a result, colleges were not able to provide financial aid information to students when they would accept a student, they would typically tell the student how much aid they could get. That did not typically happen in this situation. And unfortunately, some students were in the position of having to commit to college by May 1st, which is the typical national college decision date, without getting financial aid offers in advance, which was just very, very challenging for students, especially those who are low income and need support from the federal government.
And this will be a problem anytime, but obviously right now when real wages are down about 4% and inflationary pressures on families, I couldn't think of a worse time for this resource to not be readily available. Were there students who received a financial package that inflated their aid eligibility and therefore will see less aid this upcoming year?
That was true for a number of students, and our concern is that they may not know that their aid will fall off in future years because of that error this year.
Ms. Marisol Cruz-Kane, I want to quickly discuss an issue that I hear about consistently from America's farmers as chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, which is the new asset calculations in the simplified FAFSA. While my position on this issue is well known and I continue to push for a fix to this misguided policy, I wanted to ask you about how these changes specifically have complicated the department's rollout of the new FAFSA. You indicate in your testimony that initially FSA excluded families' assets from the student aid calculations, which is how it used to be. In your investigation report, did you observe or find the department had difficulties recalculating the formula by including families' assets, and how did that contribute to further delays in the FAFSA rollout?
So that was one of the initial defects that they found. Our work did not look at the underlying calculations or how that delay in how that had a delay in education's processing. I will defer to Melissa in case her testimony did, but I think the bigger problem is the department noted that the legal complexities of the new FAFSA simplification law were a challenge for them. The process hadn't been touched in over 40 years, so it was a big undertaking for them to update the system, but also with those requirements.
I would just add that GAO will be beginning shortly a new study looking at the effects of the statutory changes in terms of who benefited from the formula changes and who lost out, and we'll be looking at the family farm issue in that work.
Yeah, family farm, our farm kids are big losers under this change where they went from revenue to assets because farmers are asset rich and cash poor. And I always wonder what the expectation, which asset would the government would expect them to liquidate in order to be able to help pay for their child's higher education and still have a farm at the end of the day. So thank you so much, Chairman.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start by thanking the witnesses for their testimony. The FAFSA form is critical for students from all backgrounds to access federal financial aid and a great college education. My district is home to, I believe, 10 great colleges, universities, and community colleges, and thousands of students who rely on FAFSA every year so that they can attend school, graduate, and help grow our economy. Unfortunately, it's very clear that the Department of Education failed these students last year, as well as parents, financial aid administrators all over the country. And I hope that this committee uses this oversight capacity in a bipartisan manner to ensure that the Education Department does this year. We need to be helping solve the problems, not using this to condemn a department that I suspect was trying its best. With that said, I'd like to ask you both, with regard to the FAFSA delays in the 2024-2025 school year, was the problem fundamentally a technology issue, a leadership issue, or a funding issue? I understand that all three contributed to the problem, but which would you say was the biggest problem? And Ms. Emery Arias, you could go ahead and take that first.
I would say that many of the delays that we identified were due to technical issues. People simply couldn't enter the FAFSA, they couldn't complete it, and then they couldn't get correct estimates. So there were definitely technical issues. I would also say that there were planning issues. The Department of Education underestimated its needs in several areas, including for call center support.
So when there were, let me follow up with you, and then I'll go on to other witnesses. When there were such difficulties, technological issues, people couldn't enter the information, is it fair to assume that they then would pick up the phone and call the call center for help?
Many did. Unfortunately, many got nowhere with that. We had 4 million calls that were unanswered, and people were not able to get the help that they needed.
4 million out of 5.4 million calls went unanswered, and apparently the Department of Education only anticipated 2 million calls. Why was there such an underestimating of the call center needs?
We don't know, but we think that the department needs to plan better going forward.
So one of the things I also noticed in the testimony is that there was a dramatic underestimate of the number of students that would have to be manually verified, that the estimate was 3,500 individuals would have to be manually estimated or manually verified, when in fact there were 219,000 students that needed to be manually verified. So the estimate was off by 98%. How did this happen?
The department simply neglected to include estimates for students in mixed status families. And because of that, they didn't provide enough staffing to do the manual verification, which was incredibly burdensome and difficult for mixed status families.
In prior years, have there been students with mixed status families who've applied tried to fill out the FAFSA forms?
There's a new requirement due to the Future Act and FAFSA simplification for ID verification, and because of that, this was a new process that needed to be done, and the department did not account for that new process or new requirement that those individuals would need to go through verification. And because of that, they vastly underestimated how many people would be needed to process verifications, and because of that, people suffered.
So this was a new requirement. This last year was the first year that would have had to be taken into consideration. So there wasn't a historical model that the Education Department could have gone back to see.
Correct, it was a new requirement.
And when it was determined that things were not working properly, and there were not enough staff to handle the calls, to handle all the other issues, why did the department not hire more people?
I don't know why they didn't hire more people. I know that at a certain point, they just decided to shut it down. They shut down the verification process and suspended it for the current cycle.
Was there funding to hire those additional people they needed?
That's not something that the department raised with us.
So you don't know whether there was funding available?
I do not know. I know that it was a very cumbersome process. Even when they had people doing it, it was very difficult. They were sending information to emails and then having challenges with the quality of the documents. The whole process was problematic.
Do you have any idea whether there were people out there who they could have hired who had the skills they would have needed to help deal with the issues that the students and parents were facing?
I would think that they would be able to hire people to look at documents and determine whether they met the qualifications. However, again, their poor planning didn't set them up to do that. Their poor planning put them in a position where they didn't have enough people to do that process. And in the end, they had to abandon it.
Ms. Cruz-Kane, anything you'd like? Am I over my time? I apologize. I was so engrossed in the answers that I did not watch the clock.
Totally understand.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you so much. I'd like now to recognize Ms. Stefani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Biden-Harris Department of Education FAFSA disaster has harmed students and families, in many cases irreparably, across the country. My office has spoken with many families in northern New York. They are concerned about the fallout and downstream ripple effects of the FAFSA delay, including talking with parents worrying that their child's scholarship will be revoked as they try to afford college. This is on top of the historic inflation crisis that is painful for families with an average median income in my district of about $45,000 to $50,000. And we know this problem was avoidable, and this misstep has led to the largest declines in applications coming from low-income students, in some cases removing the opportunity for those kids to go to college. So I want to focus on the GAO investigation and just to verify some of the findings here. While the department claimed that it took an average 15 to 20 minutes to fill out the FAFSA application, the investigation found that it took a two-parent household an average of 9.5 days to complete. Is that correct?
That is correct for parents that filed their taxes separately. It took 9.5 days.
9.5 days. Nearly 3/4 of calls to the department's call center went unanswered in the first 5 months of the rollout. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, it is.
And the department inexplicably cut its call center staff compared to the previous year, and they, in fact, ended up receiving twice as many total calls. Is that correct?
That is correct.
The department also refused to provide students information on the status of their applications or solutions to technical problems for months, telling many to just, quote, try again later. Is that correct?
That is correct.
This obviously is very, very frustrating for families. My question is, what students and families were hurt the most by these FAFSA delays?
It was the lower income and middle income families. Families that have wealth that do not need federal aid could care less about the FAFSA. It didn't affect them. They could pick whatever college they wanted to. But for everyone else, which is most Americans, it was extremely difficult. And the folks that were hurt the most were the most low income. For the independent students, that was individuals making $30,000 or less, had the steepest declines in FAFSA submissions. For dependent applicants, thinking like high school seniors, It was for families with incomes between $30,000 and $48,000. So these are the families that are being affected. These are the families that need education to help achieve an economic future.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Walbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the panel for being here. I just got off a Zoom roundtable with a number of Michigan colleges, community colleges, and you might guess this was one of the topics they talked about. Very frustrated with what it's doing and the impact it has on the institutions themselves, as well as the students. I'm pleased to see the bipartisan agreement in this subcommittee, recognizing that the Department of Education rollout of FAFSA has been nothing short of an embarrassment, which has negatively impaired students across the country, especially those who need financial assistance the most, as was just mentioned. I was proud to be part of the bipartisan effort to overhaul FAFSA and make it simpler, of all things. But after 3 years, the department dropped the ball. Over a year before the usual deadline, they knew they wouldn't have a working product and went ahead anyway, failing students across the country. The result, over 430,000 fewer students submitted a FAFSA. This is unacceptable, since it should have been unavoidable. And I look forward to continuing to hold the department accountable, but more importantly, ensuring our students have a system that works. There have been numerous reports from across the country about how this botched rollout had deeply affected both students and institutions. For example, in June, Inside Higher Education published a piece, FAFSA Fiasco Forces Cuts at Small Colleges. Many small private colleges are surviving quarter to quarter, narrowly avoiding sweeping budget cuts. The bungo FAFSA rollout pushed some of those over the edge, and we read about them almost every week. We also have a letter from the American Council on Education on behalf of 36 associations and organizations highlighting the impacts of the rollout, noting most institutions were unable to properly package aid offers in a timely fashion. Ms. Emery Aris, given your expertise, how did FAFSA delays affect the timing of college financial aid offers?
Aid offers were significantly late. They did not come out when students were admitted to school, and instead, in some cases, came out after students were required to decide which college to go to.
How did the delays then affect students' ability to choose a college they could afford?
It significantly hindered their ability to choose a college thinking wisely about their finances and whether they could afford a school. Can you imagine? It's like buying a house, but not knowing how much aid you're going to get and having to make a commitment right then and there.
Buying a house where you had looked at numbers of neighborhoods and now you had one block that you could potentially choose from. What students and schools were hurt the most by the FAFSA delays?
There was broad pain across the college community. There was a lot of uncertainty around enrollment numbers, which affected school finances. And students who were affected the most were students that were lower income.
Lower income students, as we heard, just wanted to have that restated, but also the colleges that were already on life support due to all sorts of things, including COVID, a change in perspective on what makes a future, and the rest. So thanks for the information. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank our witnesses. They've outlined a total mess, and we didn't need to hear that. I think all of us have heard that from our colleges and our districts. But you've also pointed out exactly what the cause of the mess is so that we can actually take some corrective action. Ms. Cruz-Kane, I understood your testimony to say you had a list of deficiencies. Some had been corrected, some not corrected. Is that right?
That is correct.
Do you think that list is is exhaustive, it is complete, that you don't expect to find other problems? If we can get those solved, we'll be straight?
Well, they have to solve those problems first, but with each different cycle, the department intends to include new requirements, so the requirements that they did not include in the initial release, and each one of those has to be thoroughly tested. So we do expect them to find a number of defects. You do find defects anytime you test. They really need to focus on solving those defects before the functionality is deployed for the students.
Now, they have a contract with IT experts. Do you have confidence that the IT people they've contracted with can actually perform what they're supposed to do?
I think if FSA oversees the contract and follows the best practices for systems development and testing, they could deliver the functionality, but from what we've seen, the oversight, the testing issues, if they keep managing it the way they are, I don't have confidence that they'll be able to deliver the functionality.
Is that a problem with the contractor or the department?
We didn't look into that, but the department did tell us that the contractor did cause the delays. They had delivered the functionality later than expected, but that is something that you should be ongoing, having discussions with your contractor when you're doing your oversight. So I think there's blame on both parts.
You mentioned the call centers, that's come up several times. Has that problem been solved?
We'll see what happens when the new FAFSA rolls out.
Translation services were mentioned. Have they been fixed?
Those have not been fixed. I think we'll see what happens on whether they have enough people to answer the phones. The translation services have not been fixed. We have recommendations in that space. Students or their families who do not speak English or Spanish have no clear path towards translation services currently with the call center, even though that's the prime venue for getting translation services. At this point in time, there's no call center prompts for that, and the department's own website incorrectly tells people to press the number 7, which gets them nowhere on the phone system when they call.
I understand there was a problem for people who reside in Puerto Rico. Did you identify that as a problem?
I don't know that Puerto Rico specifically came up in our work, but there were problems for many people with many of the technical issues, and we could look into that for the record.
Okay. Notwithstanding all the problems, I understand that students actually did receive there was more eligibility for Pell than before. About 500,000 more students were eligible for Pell, is that right?
That was not part of our study. We do anticipate a new study looking at the beneficiaries of the new formula, and we will be looking at that in our new work.
Is there anything we can do in the formula to increase the number of students who could be eligible for more financial aid?
We'll look into that in our new work.
That is something you're going to be looking into?
We do expect to be looking at the effects of the formula and examining what changes, if any, could be made.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Chair of the full committee, Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. We've had you here many times, unfortunately, but we appreciate always your coming. Ms. Emery-Ayres, how easy was it to receive documents and communication in a prompt and accurate manner from the department?
It was extremely challenging. It took us 5 months to receive documents that we had requested in March.
In your other GAO investigations, have you experienced similar difficulties, or was this uniquely challenging?
This was uniquely challenging, and for context, I will say that GAO's Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel met monthly initially with Education's General Counsel and Chief of Staff from February through May to discuss access issues on this job. And then they met weekly. That's right, weekly. They had a standing Monday meeting starting in early June up until recently. So over 3 months of weekly meetings at that senior level to go over our information requests.
I was shocked to hear that 75% of calls went unanswered in the first 5 months following the error-filled January FAFSA soft launch. Did the department give its call center proper resources to prepare for student questions?
No, the department is responsible for providing the forecast, for letting the contractors know how many calls they can expect to receive, and education botched that. They dramatically underestimated how many calls would be coming in, and as a result, the call center vendors were unable to staff the center appropriately.
Thank you. Ms. Cruz-Kane, do you believe the structure of the FSA contract showed urgency and planning for a timely FAFSA release?
I think that the firm fixed price that they did use was not the best avenue, as it didn't include an incentive structure. So normally contracts can use an incentive. They may capture 10% of a fixed fee in an incentive pool and distribute it when that contractor meets certain milestones or metrics, and that's agreed upon in advance. Another example is you can tie incentives to major releases, but this contract didn't have any of those. So there was no real urgency for the contractor or any incentive for them to meet the specified deadlines and functionality releases.
Thank you. FAFSA is one of the department's bread and butter responsibilities, meaning it's basic to the department. It shouldn't have taken a subpoena from committee Republicans for this administration to let GAO and Congress conduct oversight into this terrible disaster. The Biden-Harris administration's failing will continue to have ripple effects on hundreds of thousands of students to come. And Mr. Chairman, I know we have the copies of the 2 reports from the GAO, but I think it's important to point out the GAO is basically an agency that we can count on simply to call balls and strikes. It is nonpartisan, and I'm very grateful again to the hard work that is done by the GAO over the years. And as I've mentioned, we've had the GAO in this committee time after time after time. And the reports we get are excellent. But I want to point out the titles of the 2 reports that we have, even though they may have been mentioned already. One is entitled FAFSA, Education Needs to Improve Communications and Support around the free application for federal student aid. And the second one, Department of Education. Preliminary results show strong leadership needed to address serious student aid system weaknesses. These are strong statements coming from the GAO, again, which is impartial, nonpartisan, and I thank them very much for the great work that has been done on these 2 reports, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Kiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the GAO witnesses for being here to share with us your important oversight work. This FAFSA situation has been a source of great stress and anxiety, and has resulted in the denial of opportunity for many of my constituents and thousands of young people and their families across the country. And it comes in the context of an already sort of nerve-wracking process, with the cost of higher education continuing to go up and up, and with applying for college just sort of an inherently sort of daunting process for a lot of students. The last thing that 17, 18-year-olds need when they're going through this is to have this whole wrench thrown in the system, where the form they need for that financial aid doesn't get released on time, doesn't get processed properly. Their status is unclear. They try to call for help and nothing happens. And it's worse given that the agency here had strict instructions from Congress with the FAFSA Simplification Act, is we wanted to make the process simpler, and instead they made it a lot more complicated, or at least a lot more complicated to navigate from the perspective of the user. It really is just a stunning example of a government bureaucracy failing to perform relatively, modest tasks to the detriment of so many Americans. I mean, you look at the impact of this. We had 432,000 fewer people file FAFSAs this year than last year. So what does that mean? Is that they're denied access to financial aid, Pell Grants, what they need to open the doors of opportunity. This is disproportionately, by the way, the drop came in low-income communities. Maybe some young people who would be the first person in their family to go to college denied that opportunity because the government couldn't provide them with a form in order to get the assistance that they need to actually go to school. So you can be sure that this failure to perform the most sort of what should be routine of tasks by the agency has widened the opportunity gap that exists in this country, has widened achievement gaps. So my question, I guess, is you've provided very compelling testimony and documented in your report all of the defects, and there are 55 defects, a dozen of them went undetected, and the myriad other problems that plagued this rollout and continues to plague us now with yet another delay for this year. So how does this happen? How do what lesson do we draw from this in terms of how we can systematically reform not just this bureaucracy, but maybe others, so that they are more capable of handling tasks that for many in the private sector, it would be fairly routine?
I think on the technical side with the development, there's best practices out there that are supposed to be given good practices to oversee the development, make sure that the actual functionality is meeting the requirements of the system, that it's doing what it's supposed to, it's performing the way it's supposed to, and those should be followed. I know it's difficult if there are delays or things aren't going the way they're supposed to, but it's important that those practices are followed, but it's also equally as important that leadership is involved in the major decisions that are being made and are kept in the loop on how such large-scale projects are going.
Thank you.
I would also add that it's important to talk with students in colleges and let them know what's happening. It's unconscionable that 4 million calls went unanswered when students were struggling.
Thank you. I appreciate you acknowledging that. It is incredibly frustrating for so many families, but I'm thankful to Chairman Owens and as well as Chairwoman Fox for their leadership in holding this department to account. Frankly, I think the department owes many, many people in this country an apology, and we're going to be doing everything we can, and certainly I will be, to get this process back on track so that we can provide students and families a greater measure of certainty going into this next year. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I'd like to go ahead now and recognize Ms. Wilson for her closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we conclude today's hearing, I want to take a moment to reflect on the path ahead. While we've discussed the missteps in implementing the FAFSA Simplification Act, my focus is on the future and the immense potential we have to get this right. We must look forward and figure this out. Our children and families are depending on us. I want to emphasize faith in the Department of Education's ability to turn this situation around. The path ahead requires a commitment to accountability and transparency, ensuring that every student receives the support they deserve. Together, we can learn from the challenges we face and emerge stronger, empowering students to seize the opportunities that higher education offers. As we look forward, let's focus on our students who are counting on us. Together, we can create an environment where the promise of higher education is not just a dream, but a reality for all. We can correct our mistakes and offer millions of want-to-be somebody young people a path to success. The Department of Education has already begun to do that, and I'd like to submit for the record a report from the department. It's entitled "A Focus on Improving the FAFSA Experience, Updates, Actions, and a Path Forward for the 2025-26 cycle." With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Wilson.
I want to submit this for the record.
No objection.
Okay.
First of all, I want to thank everyone again, and I just want to echo what Dr. Fox said earlier. GAO, thank you so much. It's been obvious from the report you've given us, from your testimony, that you share the frustration that any American across this country has when our kids are left the way they are. I want to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I think this is one of those areas that we're very bipartisan about, and we should be. You know, I have 6 kids, and they've all gone through this process and didn't think at all about how hard it was, because it wasn't at the time. We've been talking about what can we do to prevent this from happening, and I'll say this: it can only be prevented. We can only have best practices followed if we have people who care. We have an administration who did not care about this. We have a COO. You talk about things like calling centers, processing, technology expertise, contractors having a chance to be incentivized. This is all under operations. The chief of operations, Richard Cowdery, not one single hour of experience in this industry. He was a litigator. So he's the wrong person to be brought into this particular industry in this particular area in the first place. And obviously, he failed drastically, stunningly, did not get fired, but was just allowed to drift off into the sunset and finish off his contract. He'll probably land someplace else in government. We need to bring people to this arena and educate. Education is a national security issue. We've been talking about the lack of the learning loss we've been going through. We talk about the lack of workforce. This is a national security. We're going to truly be competitive across our country. We have to have the best kids out there. And we have people who do not care about this. They care about other things. In this case here, Carter was more, I think, focused on the loan forgiveness as opposed to making sure his kids got their work done. We're now looking at colleges that are on the brink of bankruptcy because they have lost the revenue they need to keep things going. I, unfortunately, unlike my colleague, do not have faith in the Department of Education. We start seeing this type of process. We have no accountability. We have to wonder, what do we need to change this? What kind of innovation do we need to bring to this particular area, this department, that will make sure this never happens again? We have countless numbers of American kids that will never achieve their dreams because their dreams were tied into making sure they got a further education, postgraduate, post-secondary education. That window is closed for many of them. So I'll say this. We understand that this is a national security issue. We have a party. This is a priority for the Republican Party, by the way. China, the budget, and education. And we're going to make sure that moving forward, we keep the promises we've made to our kids. That if they work hard, they work honestly, they dream big, that we will give them the opportunity to take the next step, to be the last of a string of generations that might not have succeeded in the past. This country has always been about giving our kids a chance to take that next step, and we need to make sure we're doing that. I want to thank again everyone for the testimony you've given today. This has been very, very helpful. We will stay on top of this, and we're going to hold the Department of Education accountable. Again, the flowery words don't do it. It's the lives that we care about that are impacted for good, and we have to make sure we're addressing that. So with that being said, I'd like to again thank our witnesses for taking the time to testify before the subcommittee today. Without objections, there being no further business, the subcommittee now stands adjourned. Thank you so much.